Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. We're to a section that I would imagine a lot of folks just skim over and think, well, that's the ending and there's some logistics that are involved, and both are true. It is the ending and some logistics are involved, but we're always curious to see what we can learn from some of the logistics, because many of what we consider logistics in these texts have actually become our logistics for why we do what we do in our churches. And sometimes even more than we realize in any particular text. So let's get the context here. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, looking at verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. So they weren't the only church that Paul was calling on to put together this particular collection. On the first day of each week, each one of you was to put aside and save as he may prosper. It's the surplus, in other words, so that no collections will be made when I come. When I arrive, whomever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And it's where we're starting tonight, verse 3. And if it is fitting for me to go also, they will go with me. But I will come to you after I go through Macedonia, for I'm going through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter, so that you may send me on my way wherever I may go. This is the plans he's putting forward about what he hopes to have happen. For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to remain with you for some time if the Lord permits. He wanted it to be a useful, extended stay if at all possible. But I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. And here's why. For a wide door for effective service has been opened to me, and there are many adversaries. I think it's interesting, and we will see this again stressed in our study in Timothy, and we hit on this a little bit several weeks ago when we read this, but it was exactly that. Look at this huge door of opportunity, but typically with any true, and this is something we often forget, but any true opportunity we're ever going to get for genuine service, genuine ministry, for the Lord's sake, it will always be met with adversity. The enemy is very alert to this and will no doubt come after us. So Paul, of course, is pointing out that this is just what comes with it. He wasn't necessarily overly concerned with it. Then, as far as sending Timothy and then Apollos, he says this, verse 10, Now if Timothy comes, see that he is with you without cause to be afraid. Don't even begin to try to intimidate him or to gang up on him. It's interesting how direct he is here, for he is doing the Lord's work as I also am. So let no one despise him, but send him on his way in peace, so that he may come to me, for I expect him with the brethren. One other note too, I think sometimes we forget that they also had personalities. And some, like Paul's, was a bit more aggressive, at least in letters, not always in person, as he admitted elsewhere. But apparently Timothy was not necessarily the most outstanding as far as aggressive personality. And Paul's telling him, don't give him grief. You treat him nicely because of what he's doing, not because he necessarily deserves it. We'll obviously build on this when we get to it. Verse 12, then concerning Apollos, our brother, I encouraged him greatly to come to you with the brethren, and it was not at all his desire to come now, but he will come when he has opportunity. Be on the alert. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. Be strong. I think the Old English had it kind of it almost sounded more eloquent, but quit you like men. Not quit up giving up, but it just act like men, as we see in this particular text. And then he goes on, let all that you do be done in love, which is, of course, a direct reference back to 1 Corinthians 13, and will be, as we've already introduced in our study in 1 Timothy, part of Paul's initial charge to Timothy about how he has to minister, and it has to be done in genuine love. Again, as we've stated before, love has been so misapplied, misunderstood, corrupted, I suppose, is even better term, at least the idea of it, that it's no longer looked on correctly, but we'll again cover that later. In the notes, we were toward the bottom of page 95, and right at point number 2, here are the logistics. Now don't fog out here. We'll try to run with some of these as legitimately as we possibly can. So planning ahead for the delivery to Jerusalem of the gift. Okay, well, so what's the significance here? Well, let's look it over. Point A, part of the agenda, when he arrives in Corinth, which he plans to come back, and apparently there was a delay, we'll get into that later, and he wasn't able to get there, and that was also causing grief. We'll get to that caused grief as well, but here was the initial plan. Part of the agenda when he arrives at Corinth will be to send off those that they had certified. That's at least the underlying idea. They're not just going to send anybody, just, do we have volunteers? Do we have volunteers? No, they had certified certain people for this responsibility. The certification with letters of recommendation, with letters of reference, and this was very common. It was a very common custom in their day. Without the use of the modern communications that we have today, letters from recognized authorities were used to legitimize some before others. We still do it today, don't we? Or we should do it today. We're looking for letters of reference, but it's legitimate reference. One of the other things Paul was competing with was the misuse of this, where people were coming in super credentialed with all these other less spiritual and less biblically focused influences to get people to just be wowed by their experience. But nonetheless, people that were going to take on this responsibility needed to be certified, sent on their way officially. On the left, I have a note there. In our day, we still do something similar in our ordinations with ministers. We ordain them, and it's not just pastors necessarily that have always been ordained. Some churches have ordained their elders. Some might even try to ordain, to some degree, their deacons, I suppose. And that's not a bad thing to ordain them. That's an official certification of a local church. Sometimes in our day, we'll call pastors from several areas to come together and put their stamp of approval on a candidate. I've been to some ordination councils before, and you'll go and they'll put the person there, and then they'll have them go through a litany of questions, usually doctrinally based, to see where they stand. And then it becomes, in some places I've been at, they'll have it open for free for all, and anybody can ask any questions, and some of them are just doing everything they can to directly confront this candidate to see how they hold up. Some have gotten quite contentious. Still remember one that was so contentious, it was like some of these pastors were trying to outdo themselves on the gotcha type questions that they were giving, that an older wise pastor stood up and basically told them to stop, that there was no dignity in this type of approach. And the fellow was finally ordained. But those are ordinations, which we still do and ought to do. There are a lot of people that are self-called, and that's always dangerous. They might legitimately be called, but we ought to always sense the necessity to work through proper channels. God's proper channels being mainly the structure of the church. And it might take some time to work through to find a solid, biblically based church that would ordain you, but that's still what we ought to follow. A lot of people I've met are self-ordained. They won't necessarily use that term, but as far as they're concerned, they sense the call, and now they're out there preaching, and they ought to lead a church, and they're going to start their own church or whatever. And again, maybe once in a while, that's legitimate, but that's not following the biblical standard. Typically, if you're going to have a church started and a church needs elders, where are those elders going to come from? They're going to be appointed by other elders from other churches. That's the only legitimate way that I can see that another church be set up in its structure. Again, if you're congregational rule, which we're not, but then they would just get enough people together and everyone would vote, and away they go to set up their leader. That is not a New Testament way of doing it. And again, Acts chapter 6 was after the elders gave them, or the apostles gave the folks in Jerusalem permission to pick out godly people to do the practical service. Acts 6 is more the deacons than it is anything else. The rest of that point, a church or churches certify that they recommend an individual for ministry. We also do this in businesses with references. And again, the whole point is just to try to maintain integrity, especially when handling money. There's nothing faith-based or super Christian when we're flippant and not careful with the handling of money. Clearly, one of the categories of people that have misused funds during my lifetime have been churches. And the misuse of that, and then sometimes they become a legal thing, which of course we would try to avoid based on 1 Corinthians chapter 6. But handling of money is not a light responsibility. You really need someone with integrity to do that. Someone who's not greedy, someone whose conscience is sensitive enough to realize, I don't want to make a mistake, I don't want to do anything wrong, and I certainly wouldn't take money away or misuse it. Point B in the notes, in this case, what Paul was dealing with, it would be letters certifying these individuals to carry, to protect, and then present the gift from Corinth in particular. Others would come from the churches in Galatia. These may also have included letters of recommendation by Paul, it's likely that they would, to those in Jerusalem if he was unable to go with them, and he wasn't sure if he could. So again, these are some of the logistics. Point C, Paul did not presume he would go with them to Jerusalem, just like he was not absolutely sure he would make it back to Corinth. And that's a key thing for some points that are coming up later. He wasn't positive, but he was making plans, just like we do. It's more along James chapter 4. We will do such and such, but what's the criteria? If the Lord wills. We better never lose that perspective. We will do such and such if the Lord wills, because it's too easy to get a confrontational setting amongst Christians where, well, you said, well, that was my plan. I certainly had all intention to do it, but God didn't allow it for whatever reason, and we would be then, of course, quick to let it go. Paul did not presume he would go with him to Jerusalem. It would later need to be determined if it was appropriate for him to accompany them, if his help was even needed to go to Jerusalem. Of course, he would go back to Jerusalem at another time, and it would be trouble for him. This, then, point D, this also fits well with the goal to remain above suspicion. To goal to remain above suspicion. We should not be too sensitive where someone says, we're going to pick out some folks, but we're going to be very careful who we pick out, and we're going to make sure whoever's handling whatever this responsibility in our church is one that we all agree on, and we're going to hold them accountable. And if someone comes to hold us accountable, we ought not take that in a wrong way, personally, as some might put it. We ought to be, we understand the seriousness of the work is more important than our feelings. It's more important than that. This is the kind of stuff that outranks us. Even the practical stuff. A lot of people think, well, it's not that key. I mean, clearly the preaching of the word is the most important part. The handling of the money, that's just kind of secular kind of stuff, like anybody else has to deal with. But that's not true. Anything that we're doing with one another for the institution of the Lord's work ought to be held with great scrutiny. When we get into 1 Timothy 3 in our study there, we're going to get into the qualifications of the elders. It's translated bishop there in the Old English. And then we're going to get to the qualification of the deacons. And they're almost identical. That the deacons, those handling what would be considered the practical matters of the church, are held to just as high a standard. So apparently, this type of work is just as important before the Lord as even the preaching of the Scripture. I know some would probably disagree with that, but I don't know how you back that up. Everything associated with the Lord's work is to be held under high scrutiny because it's the Lord's work. We're the ones that often mess it up, where we'll rank one work above another, one position above another. Anything done for the Lord's work is at the highest level. And we all treat it that way, right? Well, I'm not, in an official position, so I'm not going to take it seriously. And others, as I've mentioned before, some I've gotten into a confrontational conversation with before, they won't do anything of service until they've got an official position. Well, they shouldn't get an official position then. I still remember, sadly, arguing with an older man when I was much younger And he was so offended that he wasn't chosen as a deacon and could not be because of some of the policies they had for their deacons. And I said, can't you serve anyway? Why do you need the official position? Serve, even when no one recognizes it. But the Lord will. Can't you do it with that understanding? Of course, he refused. All he wanted to do was criticize how everything was stacked against him and how it was just a good old boys group that was handling these things. We, of course, have the goal to remain above suspicion when it comes to dealing with money, especially with money. We're not apologetic for it. Money and its handling ought to be held to a high point of accountability. It does us well to keep a system of accountability regarding the handling of money in ministries. Who handles it and who doesn't? I remember my dad saying this, and I saw the seriousness in it, and I've been told this multiple times over. The pastor ought to have nothing to do with tracking of the money in a church. He ought to be as lost to it as anybody else, maybe more so than anybody else. Mainly because he is supported or partially supported by it. So you don't even want to have the appearance of any type of guilt there. But this now wasn't anything to do with the collection for the church at Corinth. This had everything to do with a special gift that they were setting aside in a special way on a special time for other Christians in Jerusalem. And you certainly wouldn't want to take advantage of such a charity and have people who might rob it. It demonstrates then proper stewardship in light of the ongoing temptations that mankind in general faces. None of us should ever say, I would never be tempted in the handling of money. That's arrogance and presumption. We all ought to recognize, I don't believe it, I don't find myself tempted in the handling of money, but I am certainly open and believe we ought to insist that it be held to a point of scrutiny, and it's only given to those that we can trust implicitly. Off to the left, accountability is an aid and not an enemy. That we feel responsible to be held accountable for anything that we do, any of the resources that we handle, even in our dealings with one another. Should we be accountable for what we say? In personal counseling? That doesn't mean we have to go announce it to everybody else, but we ought to sense that we will be held accountable, certainly by the Lord and possibly by others if something comes up about that type of counseling. You know, that discipleship, that counseling ought to be, and I mean this in the positive sense, a heavy weight about us. That we do it, and we sense the need to do it, but we do it with fear and trembling. Because what am I saying? I'm always nervous. Maybe it's apparent to some. I'm always nervous when someone comes to me for personal counsel. Always. Even with my children. I'm always nervous in giving them personal counsel. Because there's always that thought, how do I know? How do I know? Now, a lot of people would say, well, there we go. I just won't say. But I think we have the responsibility to give them the best counsel we possibly can give, as closely associated with what we know in the Scripture, and then trying to handle all the potential variables that are out there in what we're saying. It's an intimidating thing, and it ought to be. And there are plenty of people out there who are so confident and they give us such eloquent counsel, I don't trust that anymore. And they have all the official certification that they follow some script that they'll give somebody. I don't trust that either. There's too many individual circumstances that go into this that need to be applied to any given situation. So I'm just trying to expand on the idea of accountability there, more than just beyond the finances, but finances is certainly dealt with here in this text. Top of page 96, Paul gives them his travel plans. Now that probably wouldn't sound like much of a sermon. Imagine trying to get people to come next Sunday and say, I'm going to preach on Paul's travel plans. Most people would probably say, you're probably going to have to do some analogizing here. You have to do something really creative because that sounds pretty dull. Well, we're just going to take it at face value because there was more to it, as Paul reveals, than just telling them his travel plans. There were people that were just waiting for anything wrong to be done. anything wrong. So if Paul looked like he was committing himself, if they thought they could properly understand that he was committing himself, then there was almost this sense, now I am reading a little bit into this, but I don't think I'm doing it too much, but almost this sense that I hope he doesn't come, and then as soon as he doesn't come, we're going to be able to say, see, he didn't hold up his end of the deal. That is so common in churches today, amongst Christians, even in families. They're just waiting. I don't know. I think you were obligated and you failed. It's like we're all just falling over each other to disqualify somebody because they couldn't foretell with absolute certainty the future. I'd imagine there's some folks out there so given to this that if someone said they would meet them a week later and then the person died, they'd still be bitter against them. There's some folks that are just so determined for the wrong reason over these things, rather than poised to say, the Lord clearly didn't will it. It didn't work out. Rather than being excited to find some flaw. It looks like he was trying to encourage them in his travel plans. No, really, I want to get back there. I really want to be with you. That should be a point of encouragement rather than a point of a potential offense. He really desired, and I don't want it just be in passing either. I want us to have some time together. Again, if God would permit. Number one, Paul writes of his plan to come see them after being in the Macedonia region. And in the way he words these sentences, it looks as though he wants to assure them that he plans to come to them. So I just want you to know this is definitely my plan. He had quickly dealt with this all the way back in chapter 4, verse 18, where he addresses, but look how he had to address it then, the arrogant that said Paul would not return to them. These arrogant being self-imposed authorities. That's how we know that there was some sensitivity with him telling him his plans. I do plan to come to you. I know there's been some that are already saying this is all a bunch of lies, and he's not going to come back. He's going to abandon you, as though any of us have any point of our faith that is dependent upon the consistency of someone else. That is always dangerous. That is never right. Where our faith, our trust, our consistency is based on someone else's consistency. I think sometimes, quite often, God deliberately, if I have to use that term, allows someone to not be able to do something, to not be as consistent as we wish they were, not to disqualify them, but just to remind us it still rests upon him. Don't put too much trust in people. God will use people, but we never put our trust and our faith and our dependency on them. That if, in other words, if somebody fell apart or somebody died or if something else happened, we wouldn't crumble. None of us should ever have a faith based upon another person. Again, it's wonderful that God gives us mainstays like this. There have been people throughout my life that I look back and I look on them that way. I've even used that in some notes to people. You've been a mainstay for me, helping hold me up. But I realize, as well as those people realize, that if God took them away, I wouldn't fall apart. We'd better never look on it that way. As much as this doesn't flatter us, we are all expendable. We are all expendable. That's at least how we see ourselves. We should never look on it that if I'm not around, everything's going to collapse. Everything's going to fall apart. That leads to some bad leadership responses sometimes with some. These arrogant, though, as I mentioned, being self-imposed authorities, looking for some point of criticism there. Point B here, and then in 1 Corinthians 1, he's dealing with potential and present offenses. Many, sadly, base their character on what they perceive to be the responses and faithfulness, or in this case, the lack thereof, or the potential lack thereof of others. If others are bad, then they can be bad. Or if others are inconsistent, then I can write off their entire ministry. Everything they've ever said. People are just ready to do that. And sometimes if the person they're looking to criticize doesn't fall fast enough, then they'll just find something else. I've certainly met people like that in the past. That it's just almost, you can sense the excitement to find some flaw in you. I don't know, I can't tell, because I'm not that discerning a person, what their motive is. But part of me certainly suspects part of the motive is you want to write off anything I've ever said. as though somehow you can disqualify it. You can't. You still have to go back and deal with the content of these things, even if you seem to disqualify the person. And Paul was definitely up against that in Corinth. Off to the left. These, apparently, these self-imposed authority, these arrogant, were poised to be offended if he did not come right away. And as we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he was not able to come right away. In this case, though, it is evidence of immaturity when one bases their faithfulness on the faithfulness of other people. This is, of course, I think, one of the working definitions, practical definitions, of what it means to be unprincipled. And I can't stress this enough. I don't think I'm reading into the text. Clearly, people, based on what he said back in chapter 4, and now reiterating, I do plan to come, and then having to mention in 2 Corinthians 1, things changed. Don't hold it against him. But there are too many people basing their consistency and hoping to get out of any responsibility if they can just find fault in the ministers of the Lord. That is always, always wrong. Are we going to see inconsistencies? Yes. Are they going to be misunderstandings sometimes? Are they going to be our anxiousness to see them fail? Maybe. Or maybe they are inconsistencies. But our faith was never based upon that. There has yet to be, other than the Lord himself, a flawless minister in a church. Now, that's not to excuse it and say, well, therefore, now I'm going to be as flawed as possible, and you're just going to have to take it. Clearly, texts like 1 Timothy 3 or Titus 1 and 2 forbid that. There still is a qualification that's given there. Point 2, based on the other clues, that's my word for it, that we have in this text as well as others, Paul planned to go to Macedonia for a short time and then stay the winter with them back in Corinth. That's what he was desiring to do, it looks like. For, as he states in verse 7, he did not want to see them just in passing. He wanted to make it a worthwhile time. Let's really spend some time together. I think again, I'm not trying to read too much into these texts, but I do fear so much of ministry is just that. I'm going to hit as many people as I can. It's going to be just in passing. If I can just shake a whole bunch of people's hands and do a bunch of quick visits or whatever, I have fulfilled my responsibility. No, Paul spent time with the people. A good chunk of time. In church, certainly in Ephesus he did, and certainly in Corinth he did. Spent a long time. There was nothing like just a quick passing through and then checking off a box that he had done his responsibility and shaking their hand and gave them a word of greeting and just stopped by for a little bit. No, they ought to be long-term relationships. I think a lot of pastors have lost sight of this, that they come into a church and it's a career builder. It's not something they plan like, maybe I'll spend the rest of my life there. Imagine that intent. If you walk into a church, and I'm just saying this generally if pastors were thinking this way, when I go to a church, as far as I know, I'll be there the rest of my life. I'll be there. I imagine God will have me here the rest of my life, however long that might be. Just on a practical basis, I kind of think quite often that if I die, I'll be buried out there, right next to the church. How about that? Then no one will be able to get rid of me. Just at least the remembrance of me out there. That ought to be, because then we think, okay, I'm here for the long haul, regardless of what happens. Regardless. I think that's the type of commitment we ought to have. We always think long term. Always thinking long term, never thinking short term. As I've mentioned before, some people, when they're dealing with aspects of Christianity, they date Christ. And I don't mean to be irreverent, but it's like they're just dating. They're just trying to sense it there. And I think people date churches to just get a feel for it. I'm trying to feel what's really going to work for all these variety of things, even though it ought to be a really narrow list of what we're looking for in that type of relationship. As though somehow that's what it's going to be. And then, of course, the nice thing about that type of dating is I can get out of it. There's no long-term commitment. And I think a lot of people deal with their spiritual relationships that way. And I say that about the church because what is one of the core purposes of the church? Our fellowship with each other, which carries with it our responsibilities with each other. This is one of the grievous points I have about people leaving churches. Well, I don't like it, and most of the time it's directed at the pastor or the church leadership. I mean, almost all the time it is. There have been a few that I've had an opportunity to talk with or send a note to over the years, and I say, you're not just leaving me, you're leaving these other people. You're leaving a family. You're tearing away this. Does that bother you? I've never gotten a response to that. Doesn't that bother you? Didn't you sense that responsibility? That long-term commitment that's there? I think a lot of people think now there's probably just something else better out there. More friends that we might have. It's always offended me too when people say, well, I've got friends elsewhere. I've wanted so desperately to say, yeah, but you got family here. Shame on you. Never works, but still, there it is. This long-term commitment is not something made up. It was certainly something Paul was trying to communicate. He didn't want it to be in passing. He sensed an urgency to spend more time with them, and that they were expecting it, and that was okay. That I really want to be with you. That's how we ought to communicate it with each other. That makes for a warm church, by the way. I don't mean heat-wise. We're already experiencing that, whether we want it or not. But that we do everything we can to communicate with each other. I like being with you. I just like being with you. I had a family here, actually a couple families, some years ago, that were complaining about the church and complaining and basically more than hinting that they were ready to leave. And I said, trying to say as pleasantly as possible, don't you see you're part of the problem? You're some of the most unfriendly people ever. I didn't say it directly that way, but I was certainly implying that. You're just not nice. You don't even want to stick around. You don't want to talk with people. You're not friendly. You don't correspond with people. You have no way to be able to say that you've got a legitimate point of criticism. You're not trying. And even if you were trying, then you'd better not expect reciprocation. You expect to be the friendly one, rather than looking around and saying, well, I tried and no one else is friendly and there we go. Well, friendliness, the way to friendliness ought to be on ourselves, not on the people we're looking at. I can't think of another easier way to sum it up, but that's how it ought to be. The way to friendliness ought to be on ourselves, not those we're looking at. I am obligated to be friendly. I need to try to communicate that I like you. I want to be around you. And some of you are better than others. Some of us are better than others, and I'm not the one who's better than others. I've been honest quite often. I am not a naturally social, outgoing person. I am not. I'm not. But I work at it. Why do I work at it? Because I have to. I need to. The goal is to make everyone comfortable. And then to get to a point where suddenly you realize it's sincere. I do like being with people. One of the things I've liked about our church over the years, especially recently, is it seems like a retreat to me. It just seems like a refresher. I just need to get away from the world and be amongst family with the same focus of why we're here. You're all going through the same struggles as well. And there's just a refreshment that comes with it. There's one of the huge issues when churches have internal issues and they don't get along. Then it's like going home, and if there's conflict at home, you can't rest there. If you can't rest there, where can you rest? That has to be some of the most fatiguing, strength-draining scenarios that any of us can face. There's just no retreat. Well, the church should be that place. Especially if you don't have anything at work or in family or whatever, then the church ought to be. We just know, if I can presume upon any group of people in the world, I can presume upon you, not in an evil way or a selfish way, but I can. I can impose upon your time. I can lean on you for encouragement. And that you're not going to be in a huff because I unloaded the pressures I've had. There's too many people like, I don't want to hear your pressures. I'm getting tired of hearing all the stresses that you're facing. I got enough of my own. That's not Christian. We are to what? Bear one another's burdens. It doesn't even say bear our own burdens. And if we do think of our own burdens, what do we think of? We cast them upon the Lord. I'm just thinking there's no way of looking on this responsibly where we are taking on our own burdens and then so pressured by them we cannot take on anybody else's. That's not Christian, and it's certainly not in faith. You're here to bear my burdens, and I'm here to bear yours. And God will so often work it out that I can't bear my own burdens, only you can. And if you can't bear your own burdens, only I can. Interesting how he works that out so often. That's a good thing. We ought to expect that in a church rather than looking around. Do you know how many people presumed on me today? Just because I've got a special talent. I'm going to use a really weak illustration here. Just because I can tie the perfect knot in a tie, and now everybody wants me to tie their tie. I wish that was the case. Not enough tie wearers out there. But nonetheless, to go through and just because I have a skill there and a talent there, now everybody wants me to do it, well, that would be absurd. I know my illustration is rather absurd, but I don't want to pick on any other more realistic talent that's out there. We would think, well, of course, God's given me a particular talent, particular skill, so go ahead. This is what we do with each other. And then a lot of people think, yeah, but what if it comes to money? Well, same category there. Again, I'm not saying that others come forced money out of us through a guilt trip. That's evil. But that as God gives us more than we need, we expect then to use it for His work, and typically His work will involve the local church, not the corporate church, but the people in it in particular. So back to the notes here. Point B, he even looks to be, quote, making peace with them when he mentions that after his stay, they can send me on my way, and that's not like a figure of speech we would use, well, they're going to send me on my way because they don't like me. Instead, it usually involved, back in their custom, this wording usually involved practical as well as, it should say, social resources. Practical, your basic needs, and social, I'm going to send you on your way, and by the way, I've got a connection here, a connection there, and a connection there with people as you're going through. Use my name, you can stay with them. They're going to take care of you. That's what I mean by social connections as well, that was what was expected. This was now somewhat of an allowance that he would take their help. Is that a big deal? That you can send me on my way? Yes, this was a big deal. If you can remember so long ago in 1 Corinthians 9, remember way back then, that it was clearly an issue that he would not take financial support from them. He would from other places that apparently were less wealthy. And we gave some of the reasons why, or expected reasons why he wouldn't take financial support from the church at Corinth. But now, as he's getting ready and he's ending this letter, trying to make his future plans, if I can make it back, then you can help send me on my way. You can take care of me. And it will be gratefully received from those in Corinth. Off to the left, Paul is a good example of one who must be forthright. He has to be direct, as he has been throughout this epistle. He's been very direct, but goes on to express graciousness and even paths to amends. I know we've had it rough, but we're gonna work this out. I wish that general expectation was always in our midst. We're gonna have issues once in a while, and sometimes it's gonna be based on our responsibility, sometimes very biblical responsibility. Maybe it wasn't presented as smoothly or as nicely as we liked, and we're feeling guilty or frustrated or whatever. But we all sense the responsibility to do everything we can to make amends. It is a beautiful thing when the brethren dwell together in unity, especially when, now I'm adding to the text, that was a psalm, especially when there has been conflict and it's been restored. That happens so rarely. So rarely. But oh, is it sweet when there's been a rift and then it's restored, and it's about as close, in my wording of it, as heaven on earth as you can get. But it happens so rarely. So rarely. We have a falling out, that's it. That's the rest of life. Maybe it'll get restored in heaven, if they're saved, depending how people come at it. But it's a beautiful thing when we can restore these. I've mentioned this before, and I'm not exaggerating. It is a common dream of mine where, and I mean this sincerely, I have people that I've had a falling out with for various reasons over the years, and they've come back. It's been restored. And I every time, my heart, even some that at the time I thought, well, I kind of hope never to see them again, being so sensitive to having everything just happen. But then to dream and think, boy, wouldn't it be nice? There was somebody that I had a falling out with many years ago, not a part of this church, and I had several reoccurring dreams where we had restored, everything just fell together, and there we were, and I talked to the person, and they were warm and friendly, and it was all back to normal, and it's just a huge stress off of me on the inside. And then I woke up. But it should be something we dream of, in the best sense, not a literal dream, that we long to see some of these relationships restored without, like, well, we'll come back together as long as we don't talk about this, and this, and as long as you meet my demands. That's not how these types of relationships are ever restored, and yet so often that's the case. So I probably read a little bit more into this, but I certainly see that Paul was allowing for these things, even with a group he had to be so harsh with, and he's not done yet. We're going to go through 2 Corinthians, and we're going to see so much more that had to be dealt with. And yet there's always, I just hope we can maintain a close family relationship, even with all the difficult concepts we have to deal with as a church family. Point C, based on the first part of 2 Corinthians, Paul's plans had to change. If I look over 2 Corinthians 1, verse 15, he mentioned, in this confidence, I intended at first to come to you, so that you might twice receive a blessing. Now there's some anticipation. Don't you wish we could say that about people? I want to come back to you so that you have double the amount of a blessing in my coming back to you. Oh, that it would be perceived in such a way. But there it was in verse 15, again, of 2 Corinthians 1. That is, to pass your way, this is verse 16 now, into Macedonia, and again from Macedonia, to come to you, and by you to be helped on my journey to Judea. There it is. So help me out in a practical way as I go, if I can come back to you. I had intended to, but apparently I was unable to do it, or he was unable to do it. And he did not, I'm finishing up point C now, he did not make it as he had planned, apparently. He spends time dealing with it and trying to reassure them of his plans to still visit. Whether or not he was able to do it is something we're not necessarily positive of. He had mentioned in verse 7, if the Lord permits. And that's a huge qualifier. I'm trying to obligate myself to this particular responsibility, but we all realize if the Lord permits us to do it, we'll do it. Off to the left, many who are offended, bothered by some of these apparent, as they would see them, inconsistencies, they are offended, they are so because they place on another, someone else, unreasonable expectation. They place on them an unreasonable expectation. You and I had better be so careful the expectations we place on each other. I expect a lot of myself, but I'd be very careful what I expect you to do, because it's amazing how oftentimes we can canonize, make them almost as though there's up the scripture, my expectations of you, and you have let me down. I've said it over and over again as a pastor, my biggest fear in ministry, and I say this without hesitation, when it comes to dealing with people, are unvoiced expectations that I'm held accountable for. Not knowing, but you're held accountable for it. Someone's expectations there, and you're not meeting them. Oh well. And off they go in some type of offense, or sometimes they share it, and so often that's just the case with each other. It may have nothing to do with church leadership. It may just be with other people. I've had some that have left. I'm not necessarily relieved at this, but they've left and they've clarified, it's not because of you, it's because so-and-so in the church that I'm leaving. Of course, I try to still talk them out of it, but it's amazing how quickly people are bothered by these things, and then they use them as an authoritative reason for parting ways. So, point number 3 we'll end with in here. He needed to stay in Ephesus because of the opportunities there we read in verses 8 through 9. And that's how we ought to look on it. If someone's not able to give us as much of the time as we wish they could, but they're not able to give us the time personally because they're ministering to someone else, we had better keep ourselves in check. We ever have a bad attitude, well, they didn't spend time here, yeah, they're over there helping somebody else, but I have a greater need. That type of thinking never belongs in a church setting. The truest of the mature among us are those that would say, if anyone is going to be neglected, let it be me, so that others aren't neglected. And that in a sincere way, not that we announce it to everybody to make them think higher of us, but that we actually think that. Well, I would rather you take care of them before me. I'd really rather that. And that's our internal thinking, rather than thinking no one notices me, no one pays any attention to me, I've got all these needs, and no one even says hi, no one comes up and passes me on the back, no one asks me how it's going. That is so common, and people treat it as though it's authoritative. God has not given us that freedom. We have the responsibility to be thinking about each other's pressures. I think some of the most ridiculous reasoning has been people, my needs aren't being met. Yeah, but whose needs are you meeting? And so oftentimes they'll go with superficial reasons, or they'll come up with a list of needs that they're meeting. The problem is they have now the wrong priorities or value system. I'm meeting their needs, and now I'm keeping track of them, because now I met 5 needs there. I'm expecting 5 needs back. Well, okay, I'll be generous. Only 4. Well, that type of thinking doesn't belong in the church at all. If I meet 5 needs, and nobody else meets any of my needs, what are my thoughts? Well, my Lord knows this. He's the actual meter of these needs. Therefore, we don't put our focus on the human side. All we're thinking is my part in His work. Who can I serve? Who can I encourage? It's not about me. If anyone's going to be hurt, if anyone's going to be neglected, please let it be me. Imagine a whole congregation of people that thought that way. Who could be offended? Nobody could be, because we're all looking on the needs of each other, not ourselves. There would be no way someone would be offended or hurt in this sense, because we're all quick to forgive, just like we ought to be. This is truly the closest we would ever get to heaven, is that type of atmosphere. When you're with people like that. Can you think of people like that? I can think of some that I just don't know how I could have ever offended them. Not that I tried, but I certainly messed up once in a while, and it's just like you just couldn't faze them. Those are such wonderful people to be around. Imagine a whole bunch of people in a church if we all could be more along those lines. Paul described the opportunities in Ephesus as a wide door of opportunity, and that, along with this, there were many adversaries. Why does he say that? There's a huge opportunity there. I want to take it, especially in light of the ones that are coming into attack. They want to take away the growth or the potential growth that's there. They will always be there. So that urgency was driving Paul, because there were so many adversaries also in light of that opportunity. His presence was needed. Off the left, if these in Corinth had not been so self-focused, which clearly they were struggling with, as we've read through the first epistle, if they had not been so self-focused, Paul would not have had to deal with their offenses. Imagine the relief that would have been. They've got all these other attacks, these heretical things that are coming on, and yet some of the stuff he had to deal with in Corinth was so petty, so built in pride, so based in temporal values. He had to deal with it. No, he had to deal with it, of course. It was still an issue. But imagine if they hadn't been so self-focused on these things, how much more could have been accomplished, or so much stress taken away. Even in those, though, he talked of some of the comforting news he had received regarding those in Corinth, all the way in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 13 through 16. He had comforting news, and Paul was not an exaggerator. All I can imagine was the relief. He longed to hear good news. You see that in the other epistles, hoping to hear good news about how it's going. That is some of the most thrilling things you can ever hear. It's not, well, so-and-so got a promotion, so-and-so's got a new car, a new property, or more friends, or whatever, but someone has truly grown. Someone is so solid in their spiritual walk. Now that is the highest encouragement that could possibly be had, when someone's truly maturing in the faith. Because so often we spend our time struggling with a worry that someone's going to stumble, someone's going to fall, they're just on the edge. I don't know, I look at them and I think they're just ready to fall apart. Oh, that we could get to a position where we keep getting good news. No, they're solid, they're strong. And if they do start to teeter, there'll be like 15 people immediately there to encourage them and help hold them up. Now that's a family. But we're all expecting to be the one to hold the other up. We're not expecting the 15 to come hold us up. Just again, to clarify, lest we get our expectations wrong and we start looking around and saying, yeah, I'd love a place like that and no one's doing it for me. We're not allowed to think like that. We are not allowed to think like that because, number one, that's the ultimate criticism against God himself. That my needs aren't being met. Now, we think we're blaming people, but the Lord's the one who controls that. He could certainly lay on someone's heart an unavoidable burden for somebody else and go take care of them. And he hasn't done it. Maybe because our focus needs to be on the Lord himself as the one who will sustain us. Even if other people just don't seem to recognize. Be so careful how you and I think when we start to look around and say, nobody knows. Nobody knows the stress I'm facing. Nobody knows the great discouragement I'm facing. We should not ever think like that. If you do, then follow the example of the Psalms. And where were those stresses brought? To the Lord himself. To God himself. There's where they belong, rather than saying, clearly I'm giving up on all this because of all the inconsistencies, of all the people around that aren't meeting my needs. And then that's not so roundabout criticism of God himself. Acts 19 deals with more of what was happening in Ephesus, especially Acts 19, 21 through 22. It does record his intentions to go back to Corinth. Then in Acts 19:21, we read of the trouble that arose, so he was forced to leave Ephesus anyway because of some extra trouble that he had gone through. So there was a lot going on. And the last thing you would think that the folks in Corinth would have wanted was to think, okay, well, great. Now maybe he'll come to us. Just so glad some pressures. Now he knows where he really ought to be. That ought not ever be the thinking of Christians. Point D, there will always be needs around us, but some, out of necessity, because of the constraints of time and the constraints of resources, which are under the control of God, some will need to be prioritized above others. That's just a fact. That's just why I wanted to stress the deferring to other people. There are other people that have needs. I have needs too, I understand it. I have burdens, I have discouragements, so many of them, and I see someone else out there that just seems like such a good encouragement. I wish they would come to me. I wish they would say some kind words to me. But I can't dwell on that. If they don't, they don't. I don't hold that against them. I don't certainly hold that against God. If God does not give it, it is not needed. That is faith-based thinking. And we better come to grips with that because that's a fact. If God does not give it, it is not needed. I say that so sternly for my own ears to hear, so that we're not misdirected. Some needs are prioritized above others. If we are driven to please all, which sadly many people think ministry is, we will never be able to attain it. You can't please everybody. That's a fool's errand, to use an old way of phrasing it there, if you try to please everyone. Instead, focus needs to be kept upon the greatest urgency, the best we can determine. I know this person over here is very needy and they constantly want a lot of attention, but I have now been made aware of someone else's burden that's even greater. I'll risk their offense and go help this person, because sadly so often in our churches you've got people that are constantly saying, I need to be the focus, I need to be the one that's met, and if you don't meet it, I'm going to hold it against you and I'm going to let everybody know how disappointed I am. That is a vicious form of blackmail, and we cannot let that type of person control our ministry. It might be held against us. It certainly has been the case with me. There was one person I'm thinking of in particular many years ago that was so needy. And they had legitimate needs, but they were just nonstop. and threatening if I didn't meet it. Threatening, and then holding it against me. And then when they would come to church, it was like the cold shoulder. Didn't even want to talk to you. You let me down. That's absolutely wrong. There is, again, as I called it, a vicious form of blackmail that's often done in a church. We ought not ever allow ourselves to do it, because we might be then taking away from a far greater need in somebody else. And who are we to think our need is greater than anybody else's? And yet that's common, sadly, in so many church-type ministries. Of course, in this case, it was the gospel to the Ephesians, so the Corinthians had better just allow this to happen then, because that clearly outranked whatever need I had, was the gospel to Ephesus. Off the left, Paul recognized the opportunity as being present. The present opportunity that's been given, the oft used Latin carpe diem, seize the day, seize the moment, needs to be our philosophy in the Lord's work, rather than looking to put it off for what we would consider more convenient. There are going to be more urgent needs, or at least the best we can read the urgent needs, and I go for it. I deal with it, even if someone else thought I ought to take care of them instead. We cannot look to please everybody's expectations, and some are very open about what their expectations are, and sadly, quite often that's done in a way to blackmail. We cannot allow that become a controlling force. And finally, point E, along with the opportunity, there will always be many adversaries. Let's recognize that with each other. Not that we're all adversaries, but that quite often there are going to be adversaries coming in to disrupt us, to make us focus on ourselves and how our needs aren't being met and how other people are letting us down. And have you noticed how mean that person was to you? You ever had someone talk you into an offense? To me, that's one of the most of the devil evils we can ever do, where we allow ourselves to be talked into an offense of somebody else. Well, I hadn't really noticed it, but now that you mention it, yes, I have noticed that. That's satanic in its content. That is certainly adversarial. So many opportunities and many who oppose. That will always be what we expect. The account again in Acts 19 came from a local businessman, a silversmith, concerning that Paul's teaching would disrupt commerce. That was the big deal in Acts 19. A businessman saying, you're going to disrupt my work. Now, of course, likely his work was making idols. And this guy's going to ruin my business. And likely he would hurt his business. And that then became a point of conflict. He was ruining commerce. And how dare you deal with someone's livelihood? That would be one of the greatest offenses of all. We should never deal with something that might affect somebody's livelihood. And yet we should, at times, and will at times, since a large part of the product there I mentioned was idle. So to stay and to seek to protect was also part of Paul's motive, to stay in Ephesus as long as he could and not be able to get on his way in the timeline he had given to the Corinthians. And the Corinthians should have sensed the urgency to be forgiving and say, that's all right, Paul, absolutely. But you ever get a group of people that are self-focused, that is so contagious. So contagious. You're self-focused, they're self-focused, everyone's thinking about their own. Well, no one's thinking about mine. So I'm going to join it too. And maybe I'm a better complainer. And maybe I can catch the ear of more people. That is never of the Lord. And that type of thinking where I am focused on my own needs. Just like in a good marriage, the best, absolute best of marriages is where the husband is focused on the needs of his wife and the wife is focused on the needs of her husband. And if either is neglected, they're not driven by that. No. So the husband's not meeting some of my needs. Well, I'm not thinking about that. I'm focused on his needs before the Lord. And the husband, my wife's not meeting all my needs. No, I can't think like that. I focus on her needs and find my fulfillment and contentment and joy in that relationship in meeting their needs. That's exactly what it ought to be amongst fellow Christians. That I'm not focused on my needs. I'm not. Other than my responsibilities, I am. but not my perceived needs, because my Lord knows I have need of these things. Your Heavenly Father, as the Lord said in the Sermon on the Mount, knows you have need of these basic things. He knows what your needs actually are. He will take care of them. Instead, what's your marching order? Instead, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and he'll take care of the rest. Question is, do we believe that? No, that's convicting. Seek first his kingdom, his righteousness, his work, and let the Lord then provide the necessities. And he'll determine what the necessities are. If it's needed, he'll give it. If it's not needed, he won't. So there's where our focus always, just a lot of pressure relieved in life if we can keep our focus on those things. So much more to deal with. We'll deal with the next section in a couple weeks, dealing with how to treat Timothy when he comes. And interesting how he phrases the things that he does, and being so gracious with this young man in the work, and yet Paul was giving him such a huge responsibility. A lot of that too we're going to see in our study in 1 Timothy. Let's pray. Father, thank you for these logistics and some of the lessons we can draw from them. I would certainly ask that it be heavy on our hearts to be focused, as so many of your servants were, on the needs of others, your work, your priority, and not a focus on our perceived needs. Let us be those who trust you with those things and are always then looking for our responsibility, even when our hearts feel heavy, our emotions are sad, but we walk by faith and certainly not by sight or feelings. Thank you, Father, for the grace to live such. It's in Jesus' name we thank you. Amen.